Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about unconscious bias and unconscious bias training, and why I think that the majority of these trainings are bullshit, ineffective, and cause actual harm. So I have been putting together a workshop that I'm going to be doing for a client this week. And one of the things that was on their list was about unconscious bias. And I'm coming in and putting in this perspective of they have 360 peer reviews coming up, and they want to do their best to ensure that it's I don't like to use the word fair, so I won't use the word fair. Can never be equitable, so I don't want to use the word there. I don't even know what I'll say. That the 360 peer review process minimizes harm, is able to minimize as much harm as possible. That's all I can say with that. And it's not about the client, it's about what I'll go into here. So I want to give you some definitions. So bias is defined as prejudice in favor or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Again, I don't like the word unfair or fair, because people in authority, people with power, get to define what fairness is. So even in that, there is no fairness. And then unconscious bias or implicit bias is often defined as prejudiced or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, person, group as compared to another in a way that is usually considered unfair. As a result of unconscious bias, certain people benefit and other people are penalized. So bias is these prejudice that we have about groups, things, or whatever. Unconscious bias is seen as this implicit, this hidden, this unknown, or I'm not even gonna say unknown, because implicit doesn't mean unknown. It is uncommunicated. These beliefs that are prejudiced to some and that benefits others. And the reason I'm gonna say the reason so at first there was one glaring reason why I didn't like unconscious bias training, and that glaring reason was you're forcing people to do something, to be in spaces that they don't want to be in. So with these organizations like shutting down, like Starbucks, I know there was another one recently that was going to shut down because of an employee did something. You are mandating individuals to take part in a training that they may not have an issue with. Their biases may not be unconscious at all. There are a lot of assumptions that are being made, and and it's not effective. And then many people will say, "Oh, we've done this, it didn't work," or "We did this and we checked that box." Training is not designed in a way that fundamentally shifts internalized or deep-rooted biases. A one-shot, for something to change like that, it takes self-reflection, it takes time, it takes honesty, it takes a whole bunch of things that a training usually does not give you the space for, particularly at work, because it's not usually a safe space to even evaluate all those things. So I have a problem with that. But one of the things as I'm working on this workshop, I've come to realize is even above this is the reason I don't like unconscious bias trainings or bias trainings, are that they're fluff. So I wrote down some little notes here about why I said unconscious bias training, I'm not a fan because it makes several assumptions. That everyone is the same. So that's that it promotes and propagates that idea that everybody's having the same lived experience, which we know is not true. The individuals it assumes that individuals have not thought deeply and about their beliefs and have chosen a path of discrimination and harm. So it defaults to, we're in tech always trying to think, we're saving the world. It defaults to, if we just train this person, if we just explain this thing, they will change their mind. And instead of assuming that some people have thought about this and these are the beliefs they hold, this is what they believe, and it was not unintentional. These are intentional beliefs. A training is not, as I said before, an effective strategy for solving all problems. I've learned that a lot of issues when people want you to come in and do trainings and these aren't trainable issues. Training is not going to solve their problem. They're organizational issues, they're operational issues, they're cultural issues, and you can't train that. But more importantly is what I've come to realize, that the dominant and the default beliefs, whiteness, and perspectives never get evaluated. And when you try, it falls into white fragility, which leads to othering. And this is what I want to talk about, because I want to look at how you define default. And I have a even in this definition, there's a lacking. And this is where words really matter. So when you define default, if you use it as a noun, the first definition is failure to do something required by duty or law. Another one is economics, a failure to pay financial debts. Another one is failure to appear at the required time in a legal proceeding. Another one is failure to compete in or to finish an appointed contest. This is the one that interests me. A selection made usually automatically and without active consideration due to the lack of a viable alternative. And then there's another one, computers, a selection automatically used by the program in the absence of a choice made by the user. I want to sit on the definition of a selection made usually automatically and without active consideration due to a lack of viable alternatives. This assumes, when you say default, that there is, and used in that way, that there are no alternatives, viable alternatives, as it says, to a solution. And what's being challenged now is that there are many viable solutions, and the default still happens. Even in the face of viable solutions or alternatives, we default to this thing. And what that thing is we're defaulting to is whiteness. What that thing is we're defaulting to is civility, which is rooted in whiteness and white supremacy. All these things that are rules of behavior are structured and rooted in white middle class beliefs and rules of behavior and perspectives. And this is why I don't believe that unconscious bias trainings work, because we're not dealing with the root of the cause. We're dealing with the effects of something. So it's like having a hard time breathing, and you go to the doctor and they don't do an X-ray, and they say you have asthma. So they give you the asthma pump, and you're pumping and you still can't breathe, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And then when you finally go into the emergency room, and when they finally do an X-ray, what they realize is that you have now double pneumonia, because they didn't do the X-ray at the beginning. They didn't look for the cause. They just looked at the effect. So they gave you a pump that does not do anything for pneumonia. And so the pneumonia traveled from one lung to both lungs. And now you have double pneumonia and you're in intensive care. So the solution that they gave you only hastened and worsened the problem. And I say this because it's frustrating so you have a room that's never tested or challenged whiteness as a default, because that's everything, how our businesses are run, how our media is run, how our healthcare, education, everything is defaulted to whiteness. And so when you do that and you don't evaluate that and you say, their problem is because there's unconscious bias and we need to deal with that. What you're actually doing is looking at the effects. And so I'm trying to figure out how do I want to say this. So you have a situation where, let's say there are microaggressions. And so I want to define microaggressions. Microaggressions is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional, again, that word unintentional, discrimination, that assumption that it's unintentional against members of marginalized groups such as racial or ethnic minorities. So let's say you have an employee. Okay, let's just use a Starbucks example. So the employee calls the police on these two gentlemen. One they're waiting for somebody. They want to use the bathroom. She calls the police on them. Starbucks defaults to, again, the assumption that this was an unintentional act. She just needs training. So what we're going to do is roll out this company-wide training. Instead of looking at the cause of this, which is white supremacy and racism, which they think I guess people think that this stuff is addressed in unconscious bias training, but when you don't look at the root of the biases, and this is not just with white people. People of color have strong internalized white supremacy and anti-blackness because that's what the system is. We have been taught and trained and learned to work. To be professional, we have to work in these systems. To be successful, we have to work in these systems. And we're going to put those in quotes because even in those systems, we still are battling racism and discrimination and microaggressions every single day. So it assumes that everybody's on the same page. Well, we already know that everybody is not on the same page because those who possess whiteness are not coming in unconscious bias training at the same place as those who are targets of microaggressions or racism. So that right there is an imbalance. And I just want to read you, I think the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo should be required reading for every business, particularly tech business, as we're talking about, as we're moving and trying to improve the diversity, which means variety of people in our spaces. We really need to challenge the roots of a lot of all, and I very seldom use absolutes, but all of the cultural norms are rooted in white supremacy or rooted in whiteness. And so she talks about, I have it's an overview or summary of the book. I also have the book, but it says one of the triggers, white fragility is a state in which even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. These moves include an outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and leaving the stress-inducing situation. These behaviors in turn function to reinstate white racial equilibrium. Racial stress results from an interpretation of what is racially familiar. Again, this is why I don't like the term fair, and we have all these terms about equal when those terms are defined by the people in power. So some of the triggers that she talks about that makes this that it triggers white fragility, suggesting that a white person's viewpoint comes with a racialized frame of reference. This challenges the objectivity that many white people think they have. People of color talking directly about their racial perspective. This challenges a white racial codes. People of color choosing not to protect the racial feelings of white people in regard to race. This challenges white racial expectations and the need / entitlement of racial comfort. People of color not being willing to tell their stories or answer questions about their racial experience. This challenges the colonialist relations. A fellow white not providing agreement with one's interpretation. This challenges white solidarity. receiving feedback that one's behavior had a racist impact. This challenges white liberalism. And this is, I'm going to stop here because this is what I'm hearing so much from white guys in tech. I can't do and say the things I used to say and do. So I'm just going to shut down. I'm not going to do this anymore because I feel attacked and my feelings are hurt. This is exactly what this is. Another one is suggesting that group members are suggesting that group membership is significant. This challenges individualism. Acknowledgement that access is unequal between racial groups. This challenged meritocracy. Being presented with a person of color in a position of leadership. This challenges white authority. Being presented with information about other racial groups through, for example, movies in which people of color drive the action but are not in stereotypical roles or multicultural education. This challenges white centrality. And this is what we're seeing with the whole black girl being Ariel in The Mermaid. And so I want to talk to you about when she talks about, give me a second to get there. The question is, what does white fragility look like? A large body of research about children and race demonstrates that children start to construct ideas about race very early. A sense of white superiority and knowledge of racial power codes appears to develop as early as preschool. And so here's a quote. As in other Western nations, white children born in the United States inherit the moral predicament of living in a white supremacist society, raised to experience their racially based advantages is as fair and normal. White children receive little, if any, instruction regarding the predicament they face, let alone any guidance in how to resolve it. Therefore, they experience or learn about racial tension without understanding Euro-Americans' historical responsibility for it and knowing virtually nothing about their contemporary roles in perpetuating it. And so I'm just going to read this one last paragraph, and then I'm going to wrap up because I think this is so important. Why these... they're well-intentioned, but as we know, intention really doesn't matter. It's impact. And why your well-intentioned efforts are not working because we, as a community, refuse to address the elephant in the room, which is whiteness. And so it says, at the same time that it is ubiquitous, white superiority also remains unnamed and explicitly denied by most whites. If white children become adults who explicitly oppose racism, as do many, they often organize their identity around a denial of their racially based privileges they hold that reinforce racist disadvantages for others. What is particularly problematic about this contradiction is that white moral objection to racism increases white resistance to acknowledging complicity with it. In a white supremacist context, white identity in a white supremacist context, white identity in large part rests upon a foundation of superficial racial toleration and acceptance. Whites who position themselves as liberals often opt to protect what they perceive as their moral reputations rather than recognize or change their participation in systems of inequality and domination. And so responding, whites invoke the power to choose when, how, and how much to address or challenge racism, thus pointing out white advantage will often trigger patterns of confusion, defensiveness, and righteous indignation. When confronted with the challenge to white racial codes, many white liberals use the speech of self-defense. This discourse enables defenders to protect their moral character against what they perceive as accusations and attacks, while deflecting any recognition of culpability and or need for accountability. Focusing on restoring their moral standing through these tactics, whites are able to avoid the question of white privilege. And we saw this very explicitly, very publicly with Joe Biden's responses over the last few weeks about working with white segregationists, and in the debate with the Kamala Harris exchange. It becomes more important for white people to protect their reputation as good white folks than it is to do the work, because they have the benefit of abdicating out. Just, I'm not going to do this. And this is why I know, I'm going to say believe, that most unconscious bias training is bullshit, because we're not dealing with the core issues. We are putting bandages on bullet wounds, and at some point we need triage. At some point it will show up in your organizations, in your communities, and at your events, and we see it every day in the tech community, and we need to do better. So that is just my little piece. I hope you learned something today. I hope it's some food for thought. But if it's not, that's okay too, because I'm going to still do what I do. Have a wonderful day.